Thanks for tuning in to the All Funds Network podcast. Today we're here with Andrew Cramer. Andrew's principal and owner of Bridgeview Asset Management. Bridgeview Asset Management specializes in development and management of manufactured housing properties in the Northwest. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Great to be here. Thanks for the time.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, let's kick it off with today. Today we're going to be talking about real estate. We're going to be talking about some of these interesting investments that you make. Let's just start. Take us through your background. How'd you get into the industry?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a weird path. I went to school for chemistry of all things, and then got into real estate. Sort of like many, it's kind of like how'd you end up in real estate? Not so much. It was a lifelong ambition. But essentially, kind of, I was in grad school at UC Berkeley and just ran into a guy who was running a REIT, and he kind of said, "Why don't you come work for me?" And that was like 2005, 2006, and then from there, kind of got bounced around to a few other REITs, and then got laid off promptly in 2008 with the rest of the world. And from there, kind of started more on the entrepreneurial side. I ended up starting a medical business out in Pennsylvania, where my who is now my wife, she was my girlfriend at the time, was in medical school, and then I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so we ended up back out here, and just kind of, real estate's funny because I think there's different ambitions when you get into real estate, and I think when, like, my father-in-law did a little bit of development work, and so he kind of said, "Go out there and buy apartments." And it's just such a strange insular community in many ways. So like the apartment guys are kind of very restrictive, as I'm sure all the other sides are as well. But I ended up back then, this is probably 2012. Mobile home parks really, even that recent, weren't really what I would consider an asset class. They were just kind of like this wart on the side of multifamily housing. And I had my father-in-law was going to lend me money, but he was lending me money at 12% interest. So apartments were out. Even in like 2010, when, I mean, looking back, we should have bought every single apartment, right? But that was what I could buy. So that's what we got into. And I bought a park in Southeast Portland and kind of went from there. Went and raised some money on the second deal and the third deal, and just kind of grew from there. So it's interesting just because the industry really, I don't know if that was timing, but the industry kind of started to change along as I was kind of getting into it. It went from being, man, can I get a loan on this, to now all the institutional lenders have products specifically geared for manufactured housing. It's not just like Sam Zell running around buying all the parks with Equity Lifestyle or Sun Communities or the big public companies. I mean, there's multiple versions of guys like me who are specializing. And so it's been interesting to kind of see. And I think the biggest change now is sort of, there's been a bit of a regulatory shift where we're starting to see a little bit of pushback from really state legislatures kind of, and I think a lot of it is justified. I think because it was so unregulated, and there were so many people who were kind of really talking about some of the things that are advantageous from an investment standpoint, but are fundamentally predatory to the people living in these properties. So I in many ways, I kind of think it was sort of a reckoning that was coming. And it's obviously going to be an overcorrection. And I think for anyone sort of interested in the industry now, it's going to be very critical to find people who have a pretty deep understanding. I think there's been a little bit of the kind of capital raising, finding opportunistic investments. And I think those opportunities are going to start to really decrease, largely because you're just going to see a lot more oversight. And, as a guy who is an investor, I have mixed feelings about that, but I think in many ways it was going to come. I think that's just what happens when you start to see an unrestricted asset get more and more regulated and restricted. So that's I think that'll be some of the changes we're going to start to see in the future.
Cool. Yeah. Appreciate you walking through the background. Tell us a little bit about what was it like in 2008. So you mentioned you got into real estate in like 2006, which is, obviously in hindsight, like a pretty funny time to get into real estate. You mentioned you started a new business in 2008, and then you got back into real estate in like around 2012. So what was it like at that period of time?
I was in my early 20s and it was sort of my first job ever. And I think listening to some of the folks who sort of went through that industry transition, I find really interesting because there's things like that I just take as normal, where like, you know, the regulation, the regulatory environment, your interactions with lenders, how you open a bank account, all of
Right.
that fundamentally changed in 2008. And so I was kind of, it's just sort of like, it was part of growing up for me in a lot of ways. And I think I always laugh because a great example is appraisers, right? So you no longer, an appraiser is sort of a blind process where you don't get to pick your appraiser and the bank has to do it, blah, blah, blah. And before, it's like your appraiser was just like your buddy. You'd call up and you'd kind of say like, hey, I need this thing to come in at like 5 million. Is that cool? And he's like, yeah, no problem. So like some of the stuff in hindsight, like the pre-Dodd-Frank regulatory era, seems just ridiculous in a lot of ways. But I think it was just, they didn't know. And it's funny to kind of think about, when you're just going out and trying to get a home loan now, and you talk to someone who's buying their first home and they're hearing about, all right, how many W-2s, get your bank account statements. And then to kind of say, when I was your age, you could buy a home with like a high five and a no income, no doc loan. I mean, just all these
Yeah.
things sound so insane now, but it's
They come.
just that was the, and I think, it's one of those things, right? Where like, I think the regulation is always going to fundamentally trail what we're doing. And I think it's just kind of funny how that works out. But yeah, definitely different world. And I wish I had more like clarity about it. It was almost like my childhood. So it was not something I had a huge amount of insight on at the time because I just thought it was normal. And like, it's funny because I worked in the mortgage-backed security realm in like 2007. And I still think about those like lists of mortgages that were like no income, no
Yeah.
documentation. And so
Those
it was
bitch
The
loans
ninja
for us.
loans.
Yeah.
ninja loans. Yeah. Like, and the fact
Yeah.
that those were at some point, you have to remember, like someone who had way more knowledge than me was like, yeah, that'll be fine. Which I find kind of funny. But I mean, that's kind of that, I mean, it's just the way who knows, I think they kind of, again, looking back on it, I think it's a little bit nuts. But again, I mean, you even look at like the manufactured housing industry, right? We're kind of seeing that now. We're seeing these guys who would show up, they would buy these properties, they would double rents, and they would just kind of like the downstream effect of that. I think is what is coming back now, right? Where it's like you can't. I mean, yeah, is it like I've been involved heavily with a lot of the state legislative decisions the last few months, and you can see it. You can see people saying this isn't right, this isn't fair, and I don't really have an opinion on the sort of whether it's fair or not. But the reality is, no one was paying attention to all of these massive, changes that were fundamentally impacting a low income group of people. So I'm, like I said, I really see both sides of it because I've been so involved with these properties for so long where it's hard to, it's, I get it. I mean, you're buying an asset, you own the land. You should be able to manage your revenue. There are expenses. I understand all that, but at the same time, there's a very real consequence. And I think fundamentally the investment community kind of ignoring that is what has created this new regulatory environment. Very similar to 2008, right? Where it's like at a certain point, someone had to step in, and when at any point when a public body steps in, it's fundamentally going to be an overcorrection. And so I
Yeah.
think it's interesting. Like it's funny you bring that up because I think we're going to see that in like the next probably 18 months to 2 years in manufactured housing in particular. There's 6 states now that have independent legislation, so independent from like apartments and other rental multifamily housing that are specifically geared towards manufactured housing. Oregon and Washington are 2 of them, so I'm pretty involved in those. But and I don't think I think it's funny. I don't know that it'll change, but like if if a if the private community can sort of try and figure out way to self-regulate and maybe correct the bad actors, it's would
Mhm.
be way better. And I don't know, it's hard to, obviously it's easy to say that, but I think there's as in anything, there's a minority of operators who have created a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And the irony to me of regulation is the regulation almost, we all should have behaved that way, if that makes sense, because now those of us who were trying to raise rents ethically, for example, well, now we're going to be a little bit stuck. Whereas the guys who were just going to the max all the time, they're starting at a higher level than we are. So which, that's
Yeah.
obviously
The
not,
human element.
yeah, that's not the intent of the regulation, but that's sort of where it can often land, which is too bad. But like I said, I kind of see both sides of it, and I think the interesting opportunity is going to be that will pull away a lot of the kind of like fast money or the sort of people who are looking for that 3, 4, 5 year return, and create different opportunities. So I think it's not, just like anything, I think we're going to start to see a little bit more nuance, a little bit more. You're going to have to do a little bit more than just buy a property and increase the rents.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we probably
Sorry.
should have begin with, right? So like, I think that's kind of where I feel like, all right, maybe this is the right thing. So I think there's going to be great opportunities. And I think it's just going to be kind of reconstructing a little bit what the conventional model is.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. You bring that up, and the regulations is that obviously there's been a lot of maybe bad actors, or to your point, people that weren't doing right by the opportunity. And I guess with the opportunity in certain areas, the regulations have kind of curbed what is available for investment, given the stigma in the past. But how's that changed in your mind? I mean, there was a stigma on manufactured housing in certain areas. Now that's kind of maybe changed, given the opportunity, and people are getting kind of betting out the bad actors, bring in more regulation to kind of control things. What are your thoughts?
I think it's funny. I think the stigma still very much exists, and it's you can go back to like post World War II to sort of really see the initiation of this market, and it kind of went from you have a home and 50 acres, and then you put a mobile home for your cousin and a mobile home for your uncle, and then before you know it, you have a little 50-unit park. That was literally how mobile home parks were built. It's kind of it was this really kind of neat, interesting organic development pathway, and they took place over 30 years, and now there's been a consolidation because investors have shown up. But the development side of it has never really, like, Bridgeview's built 2 parks, and we're like, I think the one we haven't watched, it was one of the only parks ever been built in like the last 25 years, because you just don't have that element anymore. You don't have that person with 25 acres of land that's going to sort of build this out literally over their lifetime. So I think from a stigma, the stigma of a mobile home is one that, despite, now, pre 1976, there was legitimate stigma, right? Because they were not built to really any standard. Post 1976, now HUD shows up, and now from a code standpoint, they're identical. A stick frame home versus a manufactured home are built to the exact same standard, but you still have that wobbly box on wheels type of attitude from a lot of people. And I think, it's funny kind of being in the industry looking out versus, not having a lot of experience with this product type. And I think the stigma, in a way, I've accepted the stigma is probably always going to be there. And so our job is to kind of operate within that as much as possible. And really, to me, it's going to be, it is and always will be a phenomenal affordable housing opportunity. It's a phenomenal place for, if you have, you can go into, let's take the Seattle market where the median home price is $880,000. If you can figure out a way to sell a home to somebody who can buy a home that's $150,000, and if you can genuinely have a way to kind of keep that value for that individual, that tenant, that homeowner, that's where the opportunity is. And I think there's a way to do it. What you can't have is an institutional investor or private equity company showing up, buying the underlying land, and trying to crank that, 3, 4, 5 year big, huge IRR return. It's just, those are going to be too many conflicting interests. And that's, again, why you have this public body showing up now. But I do think there is a way to kind of create, under the right circumstances, you can create a tremendous amount of value for the people living in those properties with home ownership. And it's starting to change. I mean, even FHA, I was just looking this up before talking to you guys. I mean, FHA Title I loans they're around. You can get FHA lending on a home in a park, which is pretty huge, because, in my mind, like, how many places can you get 30-year fully amortizing fixed rate debt? I don't know very many, except for single family homes. And that's to open that up. I think so that's another way to look at it. I think where the home ownership side of it can really be built out for people that can't, they can get into these high median home price markets with a true, genuine starter home, build equity in that home, sell that, transition into a more expensive product. So there's a way to do it.
So take us back to like 2012. So you bought your first property in 2012. Is that correct? And that was a mobile home?
Yep, that was a mobile home park in Southeast Park. I still own that park.
So
Just
you bought the first purchase was the entire park, correct?
correct. Yep, and that was I learned I learned a hard lesson because I remember I had no idea what I was doing, and so I drove through the park the night before closing just because I thought maybe this is what you do. So I drove through, and it was a 40-unit park, and I drove through, and there were only 33 units in the park, and I remember thinking like that doesn't seem right. And sure enough, this I still know this woman, but she is a shark, man. And so
Oh, wow.
the night before she had pulled out 7 homes.
Oh, no.
So
Oh, man.
she owns like 12 parks in Portland. And, technically that's perfectly legal. She has every right to do that. So it's just a funny thing where it's like, is this how this industry works?
Oh,
It's on
wow.
wheels.
Wow. Yeah, there's some crazy. So that was fun.
So what were you thinking when you bought this? Were you just like, oh, this is a great investment? Like, were you scared?
I was terrified. I thought that it was going to I thought that it was going to blow up in my face. I spent like that whole first year really thinking that way. And I would go there because I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. So I would just show up at the park every day and kind of walk around and be like, all right, this is what I'm supposed to do. And then,
This is the property management cycle.
yeah, right. Like this is what I do. Right. So like I did that for like a year. I just would show up and wander around for like 45 minutes. And but you kind of get to, in a way, you kind of get to learn the property. And I learned how to bring in like how to buy a used mobile home from like, and that, that's just it's great. It was sort of fun because you drive around all over the state. You find some like single wide home rotting in a field. You knock on the farmhouse door. You give them like $2,500, and then you drag that home into your Like it was a very, it was great. And, then you find like some guy to like to like put the floor coverings down. And you find some other guy and you get to know these characters. And I think that's like the most fun thing of the whole experience for me, because you get to know there's just this. You guys come from sort of the structured financial world and fund management administration. Like there's just this. It's so funny because so much of real estate is in a way kind of top heavy. Like there's like fund administration and there's private equity guys and there's lenders, and then it's all held up by this group of just kind of like gypsy caravan subcontractors that like could never really get a W-2 job to begin with. And like it's hilarious to me because like they are the fundamental core of multifamily real estate, because like those are the dudes that are doing all the work, like all the porches on all your 300 unit apartment buildings. They're being built by some dude who, he's just got a truck and he's got a Ryobi drill set, and that's it. All the institutional, everything is built on that core. And I just find that kind of hilarious. And I love getting to know those guys and just sort of feeling that a little bit. I kind of did it in reverse in many ways. Like, cause I was in that very high structured financial community, and then I dropped all the way down to kind of working from the ground back up.
Definitely relatable. I have a couple of rental properties, and the handymen are my best friends. I rely on them heavily.
Well, it's one of those things I find really interesting, where how many people just like hang a light fixture in your house and just look at it and like pull that thing down and look up and be like, oh, there's framing up there. Oh, there's a junction box there. And you can start to deconstruct how all of this built environment is put together. And it's so funny to me how few people, they just look at this room I'm in, and they're saying like, all right, I guess there's walls and a floor and a ceiling, but it's like, it's snowing outside. Like they don't really like how simple, like it's just a series of very simple elements that come together to produce these things. And I think that's often missed when you get into too much, like go raise a private equity fund, but you don't realize like how much of this is really based on just the very simple, not simple, but just the very kind of like granular manual details that go into it. It doesn't matter how many derivatives and financial instruments you layer on top of one of these properties. Like they are all fundamentally based on that very fact. And I always loved that about when I've worked with like that private equity company, because they would come to me for the interim valuations, right? The quarterly mark-to-market statements, all this auditing, all this KPMG, like $300,000 audit report. It was all just based on something I said, like some 28-year-old guy saying like, I don't know, I think it's worth $3 million now. They'd be like, cool, that's a fact. All right, we'll take that out and like do a bunch of.
Yeah, that's interesting to your point too, talking about, just looking at stuff and like even thinking about like weather, right? The skirting underneath, like the pipes are exposed, and in a cold climate, they're going to freeze, right? So little things to think about.
there's so many wild things. Like, and I remember I bought a park in Portland that we later sold, but it had just the way the plumbing was built in like 1940. It had little, like the trap you have in any kitchen sink, right? That trap was actually in the ground because back in the 40s, when they were building an RV park, they would sink those traps. And obviously, like that caused all kinds of nightmarish problems. And then same thing where I don't know, I had to find a guy who was willing to crawl underneath 35 homes and like hacksaw this P trap out and replace it with a sweeping Landy. I mean, it's just the greatest. But like, that's one of those things where, if that's what I mean, like kind of anywhere within real estate, particularly like I would argue anywhere, but certainly manufactured housing, like you find somebody who can kind of, because like otherwise that's a catastrophic problem, because there's going to be like 19 property managers who are just going to start calling general contractors and everyone be like, yeah, we're not touching that. Like you got to be able to get down and figure out these problems sometimes. And I think that's kind of what I think that's from a sort of broadening out to sort of from an investment standpoint. I think those are going to be the operators that are going to be sort of really valuable going forward, because you're not going to be able to just revenue your way out of these problems anymore, right? Like if you can go from $400 rents to $800 rents, that forgives a lot of sins on the operating side. And when you can't do that, you're just we're gonna start to see a lot more of sort of in terms of, you got to have somebody who actually understands this, and you can't be in 19 different states and try and manage a big portfolio spread out all over the place. I just don't think you can do it.
Now, walk us through this evolution. So you buy your first property 2012. What'd you do after that? And talk to us about how'd you really get into the business?
So I bought this first park. The following year, bought another park. And this is I had sort of a family connection to this private equity company, and they were predominantly in like home building. But they said, all right, screw it. We'll lend you, we'll do a couple parks. Why not? And I kind of went from just that one little 40-unit park, and then bought another one kind of just north of, in a little town called Centralia between Portland and Seattle. And then from there kind of picked up, it's so interesting. I feel like I wish I had a better way to kind of like describe this in like a nice linear path trajectory, but it just didn't work like that. It was just like, you saw something like, oh, this one looks good. Hey, do you want to buy this? Yeah, let's buy this one. And then they're like, well, you need a general contractor's license for us to be able to pay you to do all this stuff I'm telling you about, like digging out P traps and all that crap. Like, we can't pay you unless you're GC. I was like, all right, I guess I better go get my GC license. So like, that was the glorious foundation of my construction company. Like, it just happened. And then you're like, all right, what's a bond? Okay, let me see if I can find that somewhere. So you just it's just little pieces getting put together. And then from there, I, at one point, it kind of went from, more recently, we expanded pretty significantly, where we had about 40 properties under management, and then kind of did a little bit of a consolidation to kind of get to where we are today. But yeah, backing up, I think real estate lends itself to this very kind of semi haphazard model, where whether you're in manufactured housing or you're a developer or a lender, you kind of go where the opportunities are, and you try not to over leverage yourself or get yourself into too much trouble. Like every developer, real estate guy kind of has a similar story in that regard. But I think from an evolution standpoint, I always thought that this would be a stepping stone to getting into like apartments or getting into maybe home building. Right. And then to be honest, I really just started to appreciate the impact you can have on individuals. And I think when you see sort of like, you buy a park that's in rough shape, and you buy a park that's got, maybe some drug problems, or it's like got severe utility issues to where some of the homes are not livable. You can really correct those without, with kind of like we're talking with the house, right? That you can break these down into component parts and fix things individually. And then you see, I'll never forget, I had a park in Portland that it went from just like junk everywhere to where we took out, and it's that componentry, right? It's like, it looked like this horrible, about a half an acre, just full of just crap, cars, junk. And you can look at that and say, oh my God, this is a problem that's unfixable. Or you can say, all right, well, let's call the tow truck and let's get those 4 cars out. And be like, all right, let's get a dumpster and let's go rent a Mini X and let's go load up 15. And like, they all have, they have these, the thing that I love about manufactured housing, as opposed to like an apartment building, those those are literal components, and so you can remove those elements, and now you can clean that one section up, and now suddenly you see the two houses next door who have a bunch of little kids. Now they have a little place they can play. So like I got really connected to the immediate impact that these improvements can make in people's lives, and I think that is somewhat unique to manufactured housing. And then like the the returns were such that I was able to bring on investment interest too. But I think the what has held my interest more than anything is just it's like the ability to influence so in relative terms so rapidly. I think like if sometimes house apartment building, there's sometimes where like if that's what scares me a little bit about apartments, quite frankly, because like one bad unit can kind of destroy the building. And you kind of have to start over. Whereas manufactured housing, fundamentally, you've got little individual units. You can unplug one and fix it and sort of create a much better system. So I think that's what's held me in the industry. Um, and I think there's some cool stuff that goes along with it because we've gotten into more different construction products for how we develop these houses, how we build these homes. There's some really interesting opportunities that we're sort of exploring and developing in terms of just what constitutes a manufactured home, and really kind of playing with that definition a little bit and trying to sort of push the boundaries to figure out if we can get into some different product types that might be more affordable or might be able to accommodate, for example, smaller lots, stuff like that. I think is really kind of interesting. In the Pacific Northwest, the developable land is geographically limited. There's only so many places that aren't floodplains or too mountainous to develop. So what's left is pretty marginal land. And I think that from just from an affordability standpoint is important. Like, how can we take advantage of this land that can accommodate the 7,500 foot subdivided lot that is close to town, that might be in more of an urban redevelopment area? So those are kind of those are the things that I'm really interested in for the future, is how do you continue to kind of take this concept of manufactured housing and really plug it into other places that aren't necessarily the big 20-acre site that everyone kind of knows how to do. So that's sort of that's where I think there's a problem that manufactured housing is uniquely poised to solve, both in affordable home ownership as well as kind of making use of a lot of these marginal areas that are hard to develop otherwise.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier, Andrew, which I thought was interesting. You talked about impact. I'm curious, when you started, obviously, it sounds like you managed the property yourselves and you interacted with the tenants. How has that changed over time? What was that experience like? You give a couple of examples, but
yeah, it's a funny thing because you kind of go from, I learned a couple of years ago that I can't keep doing that. When we got to a certain size, me driving through the park, like, because then everyone sees you and they say like, well, Andrew said, and like yeah, it was much more difficult than I thought. I really figured it would just be an easy, smooth transition where I could kind of sit back and kind of let everyone else handle things. But you have to learn how to be, you have to kind of trust your team a little bit, and also just understand that you can be very detrimental to a process when you show up like, let me fix all these problems at the site, and then you step back and like your project manager's like, what did you say and why? And like now the inspector's got, so you got to be, it's a process I'm still going through, to be honest, because I really do like that sort of hands-on element. But yeah, you gotta, at a certain point, you got to be able to stand back a little bit and let your team do things. But definitely, yeah, not an easy transition, I would say. And I think my guys would be more than happy to tell you more about me being a pain on site and creating more problems myself.
right. Well, but to your point, you started, it was just you, right? And so going from just you to a team, that's definitely a big step.
Yeah, and there are massive. I have massive personality flaws that I think one of the things about owning a business in general is that it's a mirror, and it not only reflects but magnifies every flaw you have in such a way, because like now your flaws could potentially be costing millions of dollars, and it's a hard reality sometimes. But I think I think in the from just kind of like there's a lot of different there's different personalities that all manage to be successful in business. So I think it's a way to just kind of, you have to figure out a way to, it's the whole, like, I can't remember someone, if you can figure out just a few things to be good at and focus on those. I can't remember where I heard it, but someone was saying, Tom Brady, man, that guy sucks at hanging drywall. I don't know if you knew that. It's like, well, who cares? Like it's this notion I think we have of like being so well-rounded and multi-versatile, like doesn't really matter. And if you can pick a few things to be really good at, it tends to be much more advantageous. So I think that's in building out a company, you have to kind of think in those terms, because you're right. When it's just you, and you figure, let's do it my way. I'll just find someone to like supplant this part, but that's not really the right way to do it.
Yeah, you're focusing on your strengths, and even if you have weaknesses, you're not trying to build those up. You're just letting your team take care of anything that's you usually don't do, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of another interesting fun thing is learning kind of how to make different personalities more efficient. That's another thing that's kind of kept me engaged and interested, is really kind of like developing a team, and seeing how much of that. I think that's maybe part of more like the modern business environment, is that it's less sort of like hire this person to do this role. Like you're a property manager, open the envelopes, enter these things in the QuickBooks. Like it's much more, you need to sort of apply like much more dynamic leadership and figure out like, what are you good at? You're the expert. I'm going to take that input. That way they feel valued. And so that's been sort of fun too, is just kind of really, really becoming more of like a team, as opposed to trying to just kind of like plug in component parts to do individual tasks. So I really enjoy that part too.
That's cool. Yeah, I think people say, when you start, you're a generalist, right? You do everything, and then you hire a specialist at a certain point in your solution, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a tricky thing to do, though. Much harder to do, to talk about.
Definitely. And the other thing with like being the boss and like going over there, it's like there's no excuse. Like I think like one of the best parts of, if you have like a team like that, it's like your colleague could go out there and hey, I need to get approval for this. Whereas you can't be like, oh, I need to get approval for myself.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you tend to you either vastly overestimate your value or you vastly underestimate your value when you're sort of, because you wouldn't believe how funny I am in front of a bunch of people whose paychecks I sign. Like, oh, but like, no, you always know, right? You always kind of know the guy who's had a little too much time just hanging out with employees, because they're kind of, like they show up 15 minutes late. They think they're really funny. It's like, you got to get yourself out of that element every once in a while to make sure that you actually are interacting with people in an appropriate manner. But yeah, I think you can vastly underestimate your time in any given environment where you think, they got it, they can handle this. And that's sort of, I think, I find that sort of, and I wonder if that's lacking sometimes when you do get to organizations of a certain scale, getting back to kind of like when you're talking about these big, giant, funds, private equity companies who aren't necessarily connected to what it is that they're doing. And I think that's always going to be a tricky thing to deal with. But I think I think that creates a lot of these fundamental disconnects that I think are creating problems. I think from an affordability standpoint in the housing market in general, because there's just not a lot of communication between what are people living in that sort of paycheck to paycheck environment versus people who care. Like, I love listen to the past few episodes that you guys have been recording. It's a lot of very interesting sort of market dynamics. And the truth is, like, our advantage is that we can sort of talk about market dynamics, and we can talk about how interest rates changing. I remember you guys were talking about just that whole having a low interest rate mortgage. No one wants to move. I can't remember, it was a couple episodes ago, but just no one can move because you have this nice 2.8% mortgage, right? And that's quite a privilege. Right. But for everyone else, like these interest rates, they're not that direct, and they sort of happen to a lot of people. These shifts and factors that really impact their ability to live their lives. And so that's kind of where I think in a weird way, like being in sort of what is very much affordable housing, it exposes you that every day. And I can kind of sympathize with operators who don't want to really think about that and just want to think about getting the next rent increase done and the next refinance. So again, that sort of creates, to round it back to that point, right, where it's like that still creates a lot of issues and problems.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because we kind of talk about sometimes it's almost in a vacuum. Like this happens, but from a person's lifestyle perspective, something happens, they change jobs, they have to move, the kids have to go to a different school, all these things change in real time, and finding an affordable housing situation that makes sense. All that happens doesn't happen in this little box, right? To your point, things are dynamic.
And there's a way to do it. I really, that's kind of, I think there is a way to really, I know it's sort of it's a cliche to talk about these win-win situations, but I think there is absolutely a way to do it where you can have, let that group who doesn't have, who's not like, oh, I want to put, I want to talk about syndications and all these cool, like alternative investing strategies. Like there's a way for those people who can to sort of capture a lot of the same appreciation and sort of market that others can too. So I think, and that's sort of where, again, individual housing is going to be the thing that's most interesting, is that you have a way for someone who is in that kind of can afford an apartment, they can buy a home and that home will appreciate in value. And then like the guy who owns the land, he can make a bunch of money with that manufactured home park investment. There's a way to do it. And I think that hopefully is how we're going to start to shift into a little bit more of like a productive ecosystem, because the truth is, if you don't do that, then the sort of uninformed legislative body is going to do it for you. And I think we've seen that enough times in multiple, I would argue, even outside of real estate, right? I think there's all these times where someone just showed like, all right, you guys can't do this yourself, so now we're going to do it. And I guarantee you, it's not going to be, it's going to be a very inefficient way to do things.
Right.
So I think that's, that to me, that's sort of, you got to figure like, and now like it's going to be sort of forced upon us on the industry. But I do see, I see some interesting opportunities because of that.
Yeah. Let's talk about some trends and opportunities. I think that's a good segue here. Talking about obviously just in the marketplace, the cost of housing is very high nationwide, right? Relatively speaking. Then you have, I'm curious to get your thoughts too with the craze of the tiny home market. Has that helped manufactured housing be more popular given that narrative as well?
Yeah, it's funny, but yeah. So tiny, I just I've been writing a couple of articles, so you guys can check out my website there's a little bit of stuff on tiny homes, but it's a little bit nuanced. So it's yes and no. Sorry to answer your question that way, but so tiny homes are sort of they're almost like they're a hyper exaggerated form of manufactured housing in general. So tiny homes in many ways are completely unregulated. Like you and I can go buy a 32-foot tow behind trailer, tear the thing off and build a tiny home on that frame. That is a legal tiny home. Just as like in all but like 3 states, that's perfectly legal. You can sell it, do whatever you want. So it's, as you can imagine, invited a whole lot of bad actors into that space. And but also it's the not stranglehold, but there's really, at this point, there's really only 2 manufactured home builders in the country. That's how much consolidation has happened. There are others, but for the most part, there's really 2. So having other people sort of interacting with the market, I think is pretty cool. It remains to be seen how much success we're going to see with these new technologies. There's some really, really cool new home building technology, both from like 3D printing, and like I kind of do a review of some of these companies if you guys are more interested. But so also within like just like structurally insulated panel construction. There's some real, like I said, there's some really cool like injection molded plastics companies that are trying to come out and build homes. It's just, home building is such a highly, highly regulated industry. And a lot of these guys are coming at it from more of a tech perspective. And they're kind of talking about like blowing up the market and disruptive. And, I love all that stuff. But at the end of the day, until the plumbing inspector can show up and like do his rough-in inspection, he'll be like, yeah, that's great. Now rip apart your fancy wall so I can like look at this 3-inch drain. So it kind of, they shoot themselves in the foot a little bit. And so but yes, I mean, in general, tiny homes as a sort of broad market category it's going to be, it's in its infancy still, as far as I'm concerned. Like I really do. And I talk to these guys all the time and I say, hey, I'd love to order 10, 20, 30 of these homes. You just have to hit these regulatory hurdles because I can't buy them until I can legally put them somewhere. And then that tends to be where the emails and phone calls slow down, because they're like, yeah, what's the name of that thing? Okay, HUD, how do you spell that? And then they come back and they're like, yeah, wait a minute. What's like insulation? What does that mean? And so they are like, what's a snow load? They just don't, there's so many things that we kind of take for granted from the building industry, where like, of course you need to do that. And they're like, no, this is awesome. Look at this. You can like hit it with a hammer and it doesn't break. But it's like, we love that too, man. But like in the end, you need something that can be a legal dwelling. So that's kind of, I think, and I'm hoping we're going to start to see that turn around a little bit. One guy, there's a guy, nice company, I won't mention the name, but they were doing 3D printed concrete walls. Okay. Really cool. Right. So I show up and like, check out this wall. I was like, this is awesome. You guys are doing great. And it was sort of stupid, but I was encouraging. I was like, this is great. And I said, how are you going to hit your insulation requirement for this wall? Because it's concrete, which has like it's like, it might as well not be there from an insulation standpoint. And like, don't worry about it. We're going to spray foam. And I was like, okay. So they had these little voids in the wall. Spray foam guy comes out and sprays in all this foam into these voids in the concrete wall. And shockingly, the spray foam expanded and the whole wall just I thought, well, boys, that's a good lesson, because, so yeah, it's stuff like that, right? Where they're like, this is cool. How come you don't just want to buy it because it's cool? It's like, well, dude, I don't need to live in this. It's really, it's a wonderful piece of technology, but like, it's not going to kill me if it's built wrong. So I think that's the impediment where
that's a good point.
yeah, like new technology meets housing. We're seeing that. We're seeing it in tiny homes, because in tiny homes, there is this sort of like murky, unregulated layer that sits there, but it's also they're struggling to sort of find a good fit. But yeah, there's some really cool stuff that I've looked at that I'm very encouraging of, and I hope some of this stuff. And what we're trying to do is sort of take elements of it, right? We're trying to take like this component and sort of make it work within the greater ecosystem. It's hard though, because right, like if you take like a super modern, cool structure inside a panel wall, someone needs to meet a conventional framing system, and it's usually at those intersection points where you start to see a lot of problems. So that's one of those things we're going to have to sort of work through. But I'm optimistic about that. I do like the amount of focus that it's generating. It will just I think it's just finding the right people who are willing to kind of go through the brain damage of actually certifying these structures, which is man, it sucks. I get it. Like if you're coming from high tech and there's like kind of no regulation, like I get it. This is very frustrating, but I mean, this is kind of the world.
Yeah.
Said life and death.
Right.
Let's talk about impact investing. So, do you consider this impact investing, and kind of what are your thoughts around that, and kind of what you do with mobile park investing?
I think I'm sure you guys have seen this too. Like I think impact investing is sort of a little bit of a catch-all term, and if you're trying to go out and raise money, it might be like, as they're getting ready to throw you out of the conference room, you go, and it's an impact fund. And they're like, oh, interesting. So like, I think there's a little bit of that going on. I do genuinely think that there are finding that the right people who are genuinely interested in solving something about affordable housing and sort of helping that problem, but also generating, an above market commensurate return relative to the risk you're taking. So to me, that like, I would want it to be an investment that you're making, that you're not sacrificing anything in order to make, but you're also getting this added benefit of solving a problem you want. I'm hoping that that will eventually be, I'm hoping one of the guys you guys have interviewed who are doing all this cool like tech platform stuff, I'm hoping one day one of those guys will come up with something like that, right? Where it's like you have different impact categories, and you'd be like climate or or alternative energy or housing. And then like they have a platform, and then you can kind of drill down into those different places. I think that'd be really cool. But that to me is sort of where impact investing would, for it to have really legs. I think we're sort of seeing this like overcorrection where like all the institutional guys are just like dumping money into someone that just added impact to the front of their fund name. And I think that's going to catch up. But I think there's certainly from like I don't know, like I've learned a lot just from listening to who you guys have interviewed in the last couple of months about, it just seems like we're poised for a little bit more access to a lot of different places and a lot of different people from an investment category where you don't just have to be like, hey, Morgan Stanley, I hope you can find something good for me. It's going to be much more, I guess, democratized is the right way to put it, where you can, an individual guy with 10 grand can get access to very specific categories that he is passionate about and wants to like put money into. So I think that would be a really neat adjunct to kind of alternative investing in general. But certainly, I mean, that's my view of impact investing. I wouldn't say like, hey, I'm not going to try and guilt somebody into investing into something just because it has a positive return. That should be an added benefit for any of these categories.
That makes sense. And I guess talking about the return potential or the growth potential in manufactured housing, where do you see that going? What's the current state, and where do you see the opportunity there?
I think there's going to be a it's always kind of a diminishing supply, and I think that will continue. I think that there are people who are building properties, not just us, who are going to be really putting together, and it's hard because you have to figure out the market. The market changes. When you're talking about selling a manufactured structure on rented land, you're really going after somebody who otherwise would be renting an apartment, because that's really the best value proposition you can offer. Is be like, well, you can rent this apartment for 3 years and maybe you'll get your $1,500 cleaning deposit back, or live here, pay the same amount of money, and now you have an asset. That's where we have a ton of success. And I think that's kind of like I was saying before, like the idea of allowing people to benefit just from what is normally considered just an expense, a housing expense. I think that's sort of, I see that as a really promising opportunity. It's one of the only ways you can sort of benefit from living, your living situation, short of like buying a home. And this is a way to kind of hit that nice middle ground. The other opportunities I really see are going to be kind of getting into not tertiary markets, but really looking at some of these core MSAs and figuring out what around it is really driving the growth. In the Northwest in particular, when you look at Seattle, Portland, there's places where people are moving now that are not even within those strike zone, metropolitan areas anymore. So it's I find a ton of really cool opportunities, and they exist throughout the country. But finding these places where you're not necessarily looking for like that Class A apartment real estate, you're going to these areas of populations of 10, 15,000, but are in the right place for the right reason. In Oregon, for example, data centers, right? So data centers are being built on these, and they can't go everywhere. They have to have the right intersection of fiber optic cables, energy, and transportation. So like, there's really only a handful of places in Oregon that they're being built, and they're being built in sort of a stealth, weird, goofy manner. So you kind of have to, it's not just a matter of like going on Google Maps and hoping for the best. So you have to sort of know and find these places. Where is the power? And then like, there's a lot of hydroelectric power here, for example, but like a lot of those dams are being closed or repurposed. So it's that not just necessarily like some analyst sitting at a desk trying to like figure this stuff out with a spreadsheet. You really got to know all these different little cool dynamics. But when you do, that creates a lot of really cool opportunities outside. And then again, just from the regulatory standpoint, you're not going to see as many just straight up buy low, sell high, crank rents. Those opportunities are kind of gone for the most part. And I don't think. I think in many, like I said, I see both sides of why those things are going away. But I think there's it will always be sort of this goofy, funny category where the regulatory bodies don't really understand it. That's the other thing. Like, when we've built parks, we get a lot of blank stares at the city offices because they're like, "You're doing what?" And because no one knows, like they're like, well, Carl retired 25 years ago. He's the last guy who ever did anything with mobile home parks. So like there's an education element of this too, where you have to kind of figure out a way to get these guys, up to speed. So it's much more, there's just not that same ecosystem that exists for apartments or single family homes. And you kind of have to build it for yourself. So that's really, to me, that's where the opportunity is. It's a little bit boring, I suppose, but that's really where you're going to have to, that really, really deep understanding of how all these elements play together is where the opportunity is going to be, finding these little intersection points that really create a ton of the opportunity.
Right.
Definitely.
Very cool.
I want to turn the corner. Some fun stuff. Let's hear about some nightmare tenants. Let's hear about the worst you've had to deal with.
The worst, and this was early on. There was a guy who was in a home and was just a nightmare tenant. So dealing drugs, causing all kinds of problems. So it took us 90 days to evict him. And finally, the sheriff shows up, knocks at the door, and we don't know what. So this is a park we were actively rehabbing. So we had some units that were we didn't really know who owned things, so it was tricky. So finally, sheriff shows up, knock on the door. The guy comes out, looks around, takes off at a dead run, goes into another unit, slams the door. And now I'm like, well, all right, here. And so then the sheriff goes, well, what do you want me to do? I'm like, well, you're here to lock him out. It's like, different unit, different eviction. Sorry, man.
Oh,
so like,
no.
it was and I remember my feeling of being like, this is insane. Like, how are you supposed to, like, are you kidding me? But technically, the sheriff was right. I mean, like, it was a different unit. So now he was a squatter in a different unit. So I had to serve him with a brand new 72-hour notice and all these, like, crazy things. But that was probably my favorite crazy. I mean, I've had the, like, good old. I had one where I had sort of there was a drug situation, and I had someone. This is back when I was, like, doing a lot of this in house, and I knocked on the door, opened the door, to be met with, like, a chunk of just rotten OSB being thrown out the door. Like, it was like it's like World War I. I was running into artillery fire, and everyone's like. And all my, like, there are people, I'd be like, what are we going to do here? So yeah, there's always fun stuff like that. But for the most part, it's weird. I found that criminal elements aren't like, I will be the first to call you guys when I meet the criminal mastermind. Like, in general, it's a lot, like, once you sort of show up and you realize, like, you're not just going to let anything happen, almost to a T, like, the criminal element kind of just gets rid of itself, because they don't want to deal with someone who's going to be paying attention to them. And it's weird. Like, we found that, like, man, maybe it's like one person can create 80% of the problems. And then you get, and, like, there's also, like, that kind of group thing, right? Where it's like the one guy is causing all these problems. And if you're living next to him, maybe you'll try and steal a few things too. But, like, you get rid of that core. So that's always been the challenge. You find that one true person that is sort of the genesis of all the bad behavior. You get rid of that person, by and large, everyone else kind of cleans up their act and starts, cleaning up their stuff. So there's a lot of kind of, you learn a lot about, I suppose, sort of like community dynamics when you're starting to get into one of those parks that has a lot of stuff like that. But that double eviction was one that still stings a little bit. That I still.
One for the books.
What we started doing is, because we also had problems with people, like, switching units sometimes. We're like, one guy over here, one guy, they would, like, change units. So at that particular park, what we learned was, the second they left the unit, we'd have an excavator sitting there. We would just crush the unit, so that way you can't move back in if it doesn't exist anymore. So that was always a good plan for getting rid of some of these. But yeah, it's yep, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, never a dull moment, it seems like.
Yeah, no, it's particularly early on when a lot of that was, I didn't really, didn't know any better, so it was fun.
We'd be remiss if we didn't ask you about your canine search and rescue operations.
Yeah.
Let's hear about this.
No, that's that all started with, you can probably see her right there, that super high energy hound dog right there. But she, that started doing that. She was a puppy back then, but she was just nuts, and so just kind of started finding more and more sort of things to do, and then got into search and rescue, which has been extremely rewarding. And it's just it's a funny thing sometimes. You're out there in the middle of the night in the woods, and thinking about, like, all this technology stuff we're talking about. Like, I laugh sometimes. I'm like, the best thing we have is this stupid hound dog to, like, go out and find this person.
Yeah.
Like, there's, like, no technology can beat that. It's always kind of funny where I'm like, well, I hope we do. And yeah, so it's like the exact opposite. Because, like, right now I'm so focused on, like, trying to integrate AI and do all these other things, and then you go out in the middle of the woods with a dog, like they've been doing for 200 years. So it's
bare essentials. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been it's oddly just a very, you wouldn't think it would be, but it's a very, I'm so grateful for the experience to kind of be able to contribute that way. It's it's fun to be able, and it's just kind of cool. It's kind of wild to be like, man, this little dog is able to do these things, and you just sort of marvel at it a lot. So it's very, it's super, it's a very, very grateful that I wouldn't have, like, if you didn't have just like a nut job of a little puppy dog running around, I don't think I ever would have gotten into it. So, definitely grateful for that.
Yeah, it's really cool. I don't know if you've used that in your manufactured housing for search and rescue, but
Yeah, I don't bring it up that much, but yeah, no, it's
no, that's
definitely,
pretty amazing.
it's a very, it's a cool thing to do, and we're, yeah,
Yeah,
it's great.
yeah, awesome.
Any advice that you give for somebody looking to get into the real estate market?
Yeah, I always just say, go do something. I think there's so much, like, there's only so much you can learn by just sort of trying. And there's so many people who are like, oh man, I really want to get into this and I want to do this. And I went to this seminar, and it's like, that's all fine, but just go buy a duplex, go buy like a single family home and rent it and like figure it out. And I think I really wish genuinely that that was more sort of part of our investment education for young people in particular, because it's like, we've been talking a lot about affordability, but I mean, the truth is, like, almost anywhere, go get an FHA loan, like go use FHA, go buy a fourplex, go move into one of the units, and then really get, like, if you do that, I promise you, you are going to be in a great position financially. Like, it's a great thing to do, like when you're out of college, like save that money, move, like, and then become a landlord and understand how all these things work, and just like, again, kind of like interact with these things that you're putting your money into. I just find that tremendously valuable. So I like, just something. And I think that's sort of where we're all like, okay, but I just got to raise my first $6 million so I can buy. No, forget all that. Like, anywhere, Seattle, Portland, like expensive markets,
Yeah,
you can get into like a little multi, like particularly like that 4 unit and below.
3% down.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great, and then you're building wealth and you're doing all this great stuff. So I would say start with something, and almost to a T, every guy I know who's done a lot in real estate has some version of that, where like you buy a duplex, live in the basement, rent the top, and just start to understand how valuable that cash flow is. Because I think that's the other big thing is it's hard to appreciate $100 a month of cash flow. You think of that as nothing, but when you're in real estate, you understand that that's a massive, like, if you can pay all the bills of that property, you have $100 left over. That is like, that's amazing. And so you appreciate that. And then time goes on, and then you're like, whoa, that's worth this now. Well, that's cool. So like, I think, but it's, you gotta start, just pick something and do it, I'd say.
yeah, that's very cool. I guess I mentioned the raising capital side. Obviously, that's probably changed quite a bit over the years as you got to where you're at. I mean, interesting things that you're, I guess, raising for in projects or opportunities at this point. What are you working on today?
I really, like, we've got, we always have stuff kind of under contract that we're working on in the main market. So that's obviously, we love working with folks on that. To me, honestly, like, I really like, uh, we're doing more kind of on the retail side, largely because I enjoy talking and having conversations with people who are interested in putting, like, not this like giant family office who needs to put $10 million to work. And I like, there's, to me, I feel like I can really do a service to someone who has, some, 50 grand or 20 grand that wants to get into real estate. Like, that's something where we can be genuinely helpful. And I think there's sort of a mutual appreciation that goes into that. And kind of getting back to your guys' point about like impact investing, those are the people that I would want to reach and say, like, hey, I've got this money. I'm passionate about this. I live in Portland or I live in Seattle, and I want to actively contribute to affordable housing. Like, those are people that are, number one, will make, by and large, like, really good investment partners. So like, not to say like, there's great institutions and family offices out there too, don't get me wrong. But that's sort of what I've been focused on a little bit, is just trying to find those people directly and have those direct conversations. So yeah, but I mean, we're always active and doing different stuff. And, that's, we always love, I'm always happy to discuss all the stuff we're working on in greater detail. And again, like, if you guys are curious about like any of that stuff we've been talking about, like, we've got a couple articles posted on most of those on the Bridgeview website. So you can check that out.
Amazing. Yeah. Happy to include those on the show notes as well. It's for any information on that too.
Yeah. Excellent.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, this has been a lot of fun. Really appreciate you taking the time. Fun conversation. Where could people go to connect with you and learn more about Bridgeview?
Just start at the website, just bridgeviewassetmanagement.com. That's where that's the best way to kind of reach and connect, and kind of see what we're doing. Check it out there. And then, I'm easy to reach from there. Just, drop us a line and we can talk in more detail. But, yeah, no, I apologize if I droned on about stuff, but it's really cool to get to talk about this stuff in detail. So, I appreciate your guys' show so much for that, because I've learned a ton just listening to your former interviews. And it's really cool to have a format for just kind of like this, non-traditional alternative investing and learning about what all these people are doing. I think I mentioned to you guys before we started recording. I love hearing about this stuff. I love hearing about how there's all these guys like really doing it, getting after it and getting into like alternative investing and blockchain and cryptocurrencies and different lending environment. Like it's really cool. So I think you guys are doing a great service for the industry.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. We appreciate you coming on. This has been a great conversation. I will make sure to include all your contact info in the episode show notes as well.